History remembers the victors, but sometimes history forgets how close the world came to becoming something entirely different. Imagine this: a single city surrounded by an ocean of enemy soldiers, a continent holding its breath, and a moment where the fall of one fortress could have rewritten the map of Europe forever. But before the cannons thundered, before the cavalry charged, before 300,000 warriors encircled Vienna, something far more dangerous was already in motion. A mistake, a miscalculation, a belief shared by kings, generals, and entire nations that Europe was too divided, too fractured, too exhausted to resist. They were wrong. But in the early months of 1683, it did not look that way. The story begins not with armies but with illusions of peace. Europe had grown complacent. The Habsburg Empire, overstretched and underprepared, convinced itself that the Ottoman threat had faded. After all, the last major invasion attempt had been more than a century earlier, and Europe had survived. Surely history would not repeat itself. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a different belief took shape: that the time had come to finish what had begun in 1529. That Vienna, the gateway to Europe, was destined to fall. But this time, the threat was not merely military. It was ideological, civilizational. A clash between two expanding worlds, each convinced that destiny favored them. The warning signs were everywhere. Border fortresses reported unusual Tatar movements. Merchants whispered of massive stockpiles of grain and gunpowder being transported west. Spies carried rumors of a colossal army forming in Istanbul, bigger than any seen in decades. But in Vienna, few listened. Few understood. And some, of course, chose denial over uncertainty. It was a dangerous habit, one that would cost tens of thousands their lives. Because while Europe slept, the man who would soon command the largest invading force of the 17th century was already preparing the coming storm. His name was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, commander of armies, architect of war, a man whose ambition burned brighter than the empire he served. He believed that conquering Vienna was not merely a military objective, it was a divine mandate. A historical correction. A final step in turning the Ottoman dream into European reality. And when he spoke, the Sultan listened. Kara Mustafa promised something extraordinary. Take Vienna, and the road to Europe lies open. From that moment, the empire's full weight began to shift westward. Within weeks, the plains outside Istanbul transformed into a sea of tents and banners. Janissaries, elite soldiers trained from childhood, polished their rifles and curved blades. Sipahi cavalry prepared their mounts, tightening saddles, sharpening lances, whispering prayers of victory. Tatar raiders arrived in waves, bringing with them tales of past conquests and promises of plunder to come. Engineers measured distances and drew maps of the city they had not yet reached. Artillery commanders tested cannons designed to smash stone walls like pottery. Carpenters prepared mobile fortifications, siege towers, and wooden bridges. And behind them came the lifeblood of any war machine. Wagons filled with food, gunpowder, medical herbs, ropes, shovels, and the endless tools required for a long siege. This was not an army. This was a migration of war. A nation on the march. Nearly 300,000 men. The largest Ottoman army in a generation. And yet, the defenders of Vienna had no idea what was approaching. Inside the city, life moved at its usual pace. Merchants opened their shops. Church bells carried across the cobblestone streets. Children played in the shadow of the great cathedral. Rumors of danger existed, yes, but they were vague, distant, easy to ignore. Vienna had grown comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of preparation. The city walls were old. The garrison was small. Supplies were limited. And morale, a fragile thing easily shaken. Only a handful of commanders truly understood the danger. One of them was Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, Vienna's military governor, a man outnumbered, outmatched, and soon to be surrounded. He pleaded for reinforcements. He begged for political unity. He warned that Vienna could not withstand a modern Ottoman siege. But Europe was distracted by its own rivalries. France eyed Austrian territory. German states bickered. Poland watched cautiously. And Protestant and Catholic kingdoms struggled to trust one another. Vienna's fate, it seemed, would be left to Vienna alone. Until a single message changed everything. A rider arrived, breathless and pale, his horse collapsing under him. He carried just 9 words. "They are coming. The entire Ottoman army is coming." And with that, everything changed. Panic spread across the city. Families fled. Men who had never held a musket were forced into service. Bakers became soldiers. Students became sentries. Priests prepared for a siege that might end in massacre. Cannons were dragged into position. Walls hastily repaired. Supplies rationed. Gates fortified. But the people knew the truth. 15,000 defenders against 300,000 attackers. The math alone felt like a death sentence. Yet there was something else, something no army could calculate. A belief, a fire, a stubborn refusal to surrender. Vienna would not fall without a fight. And Europe would not watch quietly. Because far to the north, a king was already preparing to ride to war. A man whose appearance on the battlefield would become legend. But at this moment, early 1683, no one knew if he would arrive in time, or if Vienna would be ashes by the time he did. The Ottoman tide was rising, and the walls of Vienna were about to face their greatest test. At dawn on July 14, 1683, the people of Vienna climbed their walls and saw the impossible. Fields where farmers once worked were now black with soldiers. The horizon itself looked alive, shifting, moving, crawling, like a living tide of steel. This was no rumor, no warning, no distant threat. This was the beginning. From the battlements, defenders stared in silence as the Ottoman host unfolded across the plains like a dark canvas. Thousands of tents appeared in perfect rows, white, green, scarlet, stretching so far that the end could not be seen. Cavalry detachments rode in sweeping arcs, marking territory. Engineers began measuring distances to the city walls. And in the center of it all, towering above every other pavilion, stood the massive ebony tent of Kara Mustafa Pasha. The Grand Vizier had arrived. He stepped out wearing emerald robes, flanked by elite janissaries. He looked upon Vienna as if it were already conquered. To him, this was not a battle. It was destiny. And the defenders. To Kara Mustafa, they were merely a formality. An obstacle to be removed before he marched deeper into Europe. But he underestimated something crucial, something he would later pay for with his life. Vienna's walls may have been old, but its resolve was brand new. Inside the city, chaos transformed quickly into structure. Count Starhemberg took command with an iron will. He knew Vienna had no chance if it panicked. So he issued orders with brutal efficiency. All civilians inside the walls. No one leaves. All food rationed. All shops closed. Every man capable of holding a weapon, report immediately. Churches became hospitals. Wine cellars became ammunition stores. Mansions were stripped for wood to reinforce barricades. And from morning until night, the echo of hammers filled the streets as Vienna prepared for the storm. But even as they worked, fear lingered. 15,000 defenders, 300,000 attackers. No one needed to say the numbers aloud. On the second day, the first Ottoman cannons were dragged into position. Massive bronze guns, some weighing more than a ton, their barrels carved with verses promising victory. Artillery officers chose their angles carefully, marking weak points along the city walls. It was not a question of if the walls would break. It was a matter of when. And when the first cannon roared, Vienna felt the blow like the fist of a giant. Stone shattered. Dust filled the air. Children cried in the streets. And the siege officially had begun. But a siege is a war of patience, a war of endurance. And Kara Mustafa had brought an army ready to grind Vienna into dust. Yet he did not attack recklessly. He had a different plan, one that terrified Starhemberg when he finally realized it. Kara Mustafa did not want to destroy Vienna. He wanted to capture it intact. The churches, the palaces, the wealth, the symbolism. To him, Vienna was not merely a victory. It was a prize. That meant no all-out assault. No storming of the walls with reckless casualties. Instead, he began something far more precise, far more clinical, far more deadly. Mining. Ottoman engineers dug tunnels under the ground, deep, silent, invisible. Their goal was simple: reach the foundations of Vienna's walls, place barrels of gunpowder, blow the defenses apart from below. Starhemberg understood the danger immediately. He organized counterminers, soldiers who listened for the sound of shovels through the earth. Men who fought underground in total darkness. Men who died without ever seeing the enemy's face. Above ground, the shelling continued nonstop. Roofs collapsed. Streets crumbled. Homes burned. Vienna was slowly being crushed. Days passed. Then weeks. Food dwindled. Water was rationed by the cup. And the once proud city felt like a trapped animal. Starvation loomed. Disease spread. Cannon fire shook the walls day and night. Still, Vienna refused to surrender. Priests walked the streets offering blessings. Mothers carried water to the ramparts so soldiers could continue fighting. And every night, crowds gathered in the cathedral to pray for a miracle. Because that was what they needed. A miracle. And across Europe, something remarkable was beginning to happen. A miracle was forming. Kings who hated each other. States that distrusted one another. Princes who had once plotted against the Habsburgs. They all realized the same truth. If Vienna fell, they would be next. So messages were sent. Old rivalries were set aside. New alliances formed with frightening speed. And far away in Poland, a king read Vienna's desperate letters, placed them gently on a table, and made a decision that would reshape the continent. His name was Jan III Sobieski, one of the greatest cavalry commanders in European history, a man who had never lost a major battle. And when he heard that Vienna was surrounded by 300,000 soldiers, he did not hesitate. "Prepare the army," he said. "We ride." But could he reach Vienna before it fell? Before the walls collapsed? Before Kara Mustafa broke through? No one knew. Because by late August, Vienna was dying. Inside the city, gunpowder ran dangerously low. Defenders reused bullets by collecting them from the ruins. Starhemberg himself fought on the walls, wounded twice, refusing to step down. But the Ottoman mining operations were becoming too effective. One morning, a section of the wall near the Berg bastion cracked, not from cannons but from below. Starhemberg ordered every available soldier to reinforce it. Women and children formed chains carrying stones, wood, and sandbags. The defenders managed to hold the breach for the day. But the next explosion would be bigger, stronger, unstoppable. And Kara Mustafa knew it. He believed he was only days away from victory. He wrote letters to the Sultan describing Vienna's inevitable fall. He prepared the victory parade route. He even sent word to reserve troops to prepare for a march toward northern Europe. He thought nothing could save Vienna. He believed the city was already his. But he did not know something crucial. At that very moment, an army was forming. An army unlike anything Europe had seen in a century. An army led by the one man Kara Mustafa truly feared. Jan III Sobieski, the Lion of Poland, the winged Hussar king. And he was riding straight toward Vienna. End of part 2. Continue. Yes or no? Yes, before Vienna could be saved, Europe needed a miracle. Instead, it got a man who made miracles happen with cavalry. Far beyond the burning city, past the plains and the shattered villages, an army was gathering with a speed that stunned even its own commanders. Riders sprinted from kingdom to kingdom, carrying a message that felt less like a plea and more like a warning. If Vienna falls, Europe follows. And this time, Europe listened. German princes rallied their troops. Austrian forces regrouped. Knights who had not ridden in generations polished armor long stored in castle basements. Veteran mercenaries took up muskets once more. But the center of this growing coalition was Poland, because where others hesitated, one man did not. Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, commander of armies, master of battlefield timing, a leader whose very name carried weight across Europe. He read Vienna's final letter, Starhemberg's desperate plea, and his decision was instant. "We march at once," he declared. No hesitation, no debate, no fear. Sobieski understood what few others saw clearly. If Vienna fell, the Ottoman armies would not stop. They would move into the German states, seize the Danube, and unravel Europe one fortress at a time. This was not merely a war between empires. It was a civilizational crossroads. And Sobieski intended to stand at that crossroads with his sword drawn. By late August, his army began moving south, slow at first, then faster each day. Regiments from Krakow, Poznan, and Lwów joined the march. Cavalry detachments thundered across open fields, stirring clouds of dust that stretched for miles. Supply wagons raced to keep up. And at the center rode Sobieski himself on a white stallion, wearing the leopard skin of a Polish Hussar and radiating the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. But even his strength had limits. The route to Vienna was long, and the Ottomans had already reached the walls. Every hour of delay meant more suffering inside the city. And inside those walls, the situation was collapsing. By early September, Vienna was nearly broken. Ottoman cannons hammered the defenses constantly, shaking the city like a drum. Entire districts lay in ruins. Fires burned for days. Smoke clung to the skyline like a mourning shroud. Food had run out. People were boiling leather for soup. Water was drawn from wells contaminated by debris and blood. And the walls, they were crumbling. The Ottomans' mining operations grew more precise every day. Explosions carved entire sections out of the city's outer bastions. Defenders fought hand-to-hand in the breach, plugging gaps with sandbags, broken stones, and their own bodies. Count Starhemberg had been wounded 3 times, but refused to be carried from the field. Bandages soaked with blood, he commanded from the walls, musket in hand, shouting orders over cannon fire. Vienna heard one rumor more than any other. No help is coming. And for a time it seemed true. Because the coalition army had not yet arrived. Because the Ottomans were preparing their largest explosion yet, one that would obliterate the inner defenses. Because Kara Mustafa believed victory was inevitable. He increased pressure daily, pushed his janissaries to tighten the ring, ordered more tunnels, more powder, more precision. He felt Vienna trembling. He thought he could smell the end. But he did not know he was being hunted. On September 6th, scouts from the Ottoman vanguard spotted something on the horizon. Dust. Movement. A shimmer of metal. At first, they assumed it was a small Austrian detachment. But as the dust cleared, they saw banners, many banners, representing kingdoms, cities, and dukedoms across Europe. And at the center, riding in perfect formation, were men wearing wings made of eagle feathers rising from their backs. The Polish winged hussars. The shock traveled through the Ottoman camp like a storm. No one expected the Poles to arrive this quickly. Certainly not at full strength. And definitely not leading an army of allies. But the sight of the hussars sent a message that no words could capture. Vienna was no longer alone. Kara Mustafa realized he now had a new enemy. A far greater one. He ordered his men to fortify the ridges around the Kahlenberg Heights, terrain that offered commanding views of Vienna. If the coalition controlled the heights, the Ottomans would be trapped between Vienna and a relief army. He could not let that happen. But neither could Sobieski. The Polish king reached the outskirts of Vienna on September 11th. He surveyed the battlefield with trained eyes. He saw the Ottoman positions, the trenches, the artillery nests. He saw the starving, desperate defenders on the walls. He saw the smoke rising from a city moments from collapse. And he made a decision that would define the fate of Europe. We attack at dawn. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not after resting his men. Tomorrow. Because Vienna did not have another day to give. As night fell, both armies prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles in world history. Ottoman soldiers sharpened blades under torchlight. Janissaries prayed facing Mecca. Siege engineers loaded powder under the walls for their final, devastating blast. Inside Vienna, citizens gathered in churches, holding candles, praying for dawn. For salvation. For Sobieski's cavalry to arrive in time. And in the coalition camp, commanders debated strategies around maps lit by flickering fire. But one thing was certain. This battle would decide the future of Europe. And as Sobieski mounted his horse before sunrise, he looked toward Vienna and whispered a single promise. Today God will decide. What came next would become legend. A battle of kings, empires, faiths, and civilizations colliding in a single moment. But before the cavalry could charge, the armies first had to take the mountain. And that was where the bloodshed would begin. Dawn broke over Vienna with a glow that looked almost peaceful. But peace was an illusion. Because on this day, September 12, 1683, the largest cavalry charge in European history was about to erupt. And before that thunder came the fire. The battle began high in the hills above Vienna, where Sobieski had positioned the coalition forces along the slopes of the Kahlenberg and Leopoldsburg mountains. The sun was barely rising when he ordered the first movement. Advance the infantry. German, Austrian, and Polish foot soldiers pushed forward in staggered lines, climbing down the slopes toward the Ottoman positions dug into the foothills. Muskets cracked, cannons roared, smoke rolled across the battlefield like a second sunrise. But what truly shaped the morning was the terrain: narrow ridges, steep drops, tangled forests, and deep ravines. perfect defensive ground for the Ottomans. Kara Mustafa had fortified these heights heavily. Janissaries, sharpshooters, and artillery detachments occupied hidden positions among trees and rocks, ready to break the coalition's advance before it ever reached the plains below. Their first volley was so brutal that some commanders believed the ascent might be impossible. Muskets fired downward with deadly precision. Gunners rained grape-shot onto the advancing German regiments. Arrows from Tatar cavalry units struck from impossible angles. For a moment, the hillside turned into a slaughterhouse. But Sobieski had planned for this. He ordered the Bavarian and Saxon contingents to push hard on the left, drawing Ottoman attention. At the same time, he personally directed the Polish infantry to press the center, slowly grinding through the thick forest toward the ridgeline. The coalition forces fought uphill, step by step, musket by musket, using trees as cover and bayonets as climbing tools. What they lacked in position, they made up for in resolve, because every man knew what lay beyond this ridge. Vienna, a city moments from death. By mid-morning, the battle stretched across a 3-mile front. The noise was overwhelming, cannons echoing through the hills, drums pounding, men shouting orders in German, Polish, and Latin. The Ottomans fought fiercely. Janissaries were masters of close-quarters combat, hacking through coalition lines whenever the muskets fell silent. Tatar cavalry swept through the lower forest trails, striking exposed flank units and disappearing before counterattacks could form. But even as the Ottomans inflicted heavy losses, something began to shift. The coalition forces kept advancing. Inch by inch, tree by tree, hill by hill. They fought with the desperation of men who knew that if they failed, the entire continent would collapse behind them. Kara Mustafa rode among his troops, urging them on. He believed that if he could hold the heights until afternoon, the coalition would exhaust itself, crumble, and retreat. He told his officers, "Break their climb, and the victory is ours." But in his calculations, he overlooked one thing. Sobieski. Shortly before noon, Sobieski surveyed the battlefield from horseback. His infantry had reached the upper slopes. German and Austrian regiments had broken through a major Ottoman trench line, and the Polish troops, fighting in tight formation, were pushing toward the center ridge. The heights were not yet taken, but they were close, and that meant the second phase of Sobieski's plan could finally begin. He turned to the 3,000 hussars behind him, the elite cavalry of Poland, wearing leopard skins, eagle feathers, and armor that gleamed like polished silver. "You will hold until I call," he commanded. And they waited, silent, still, deadly. Across the ridges, the coalition infantry continued their assault. Muskets flashed like fireflies. Bayonets clashed. Cannon smoke filled the air until the sun itself seemed to vanish behind a wall of battle. Slowly, painfully, the Ottoman positions on the heights began to break. Janissaries were forced back. Artillery crews abandoned guns. Tatar units retreated to reorganize. The forest, once so hostile, now echoed with the sound of coalition victory. By 2 p.m., Sobieski finally received the message he had been waiting for. The heights are ours. The coalition now controlled the high ground. And from that moment, the fate of the battle and of Europe shifted. Because once the heights were secure, there was nothing left between Sobieski's cavalry and the open plains leading directly to the Ottoman camp. Exactly as he had planned from the beginning. Kara Mustafa realized the danger instantly. He reorganized the Ottoman lines, pulling cavalry toward the center and shifting janissaries into the plains. His plan was simple: hold the ground long enough to force a coalition retreat at sunset. But he misjudged the timing. Because by late afternoon, the coalition army, over 70,000 strong, was emerging from the forests, forming ranks across the slopes, ready to descend upon the Ottoman positions like a human avalanche. Sobieski rode before his men and issued the final order. Prepare the cavalry. It was the moment the winged hussars had trained for their entire lives. Behind them, thousands of German and Austrian horsemen also formed into columns. Banners snapped in the wind, horses pawed at the earth, armor glinted beneath the fading sunlight. And then it happened. At approximately 4 p.m., Sobieski raised his saber, and the largest cavalry charge in European history began. 30,000 cavalry surged forward at once. The ground shook like an earthquake. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder. Ottoman soldiers looked up and saw death descending upon them, fast, disciplined, unstoppable. Drums beat. Horns blared. But nothing could stop that avalanche of hooves. Sobieski led the charge from the front, the wings of his hussars slicing through the wind as they crashed into the Ottoman center. The impact was catastrophic. Ottoman lines shattered. Janissaries fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by sheer momentum. Cavalry engagements erupted across the plains as thousands of riders clashed in dust and steel. The hussars cut through enemy ranks like fire through dry grass. And for the first time in the siege, fear gripped Kara Mustafa himself. He knew the line was collapsing. He knew the center was breaking. He knew the plains were lost. Vienna was no longer the prize. Now it was the trap. And the question on every defender's lips was the same. Would the Ottomans hold? Or would they run? The answer was about to be written in blood.